Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Mark Turi, and our weekly Saturday uh, evening for me, maybe afternoon or something for you, maybe morning for you, wherever you are. As I always like to start off by saying, of course, please give this video a like if you haven't already, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'm doing about the same with subscribers, so somewhere around 1,200, which I think is really, really great for a channel like mine. Of course, I'd like to get more, so if you haven't already subscribed, please do that. And then, of course, on top of that, not only give this video a like, but I am now 490 public watch hours away from getting to my 1,500 so I can get monetized, which would be nice. So I do have some remade and reworked watch lists and playlists on my channel, which you can click. I have history, religion, politics, pop culture, and others, languages, of course, as well. And yeah, it would be really, really nice if you know you could go over there and just click a video that you think is nice and go through the couple hours on that. So that again, that would be interesting if that's something you could do to help the channel. In addition to that, I usually like to sort of talk a little bit about what I've been doing for the week. But to be perfectly honest, I don't think there's that much going on here. It's been not as hot as it was the week before, thankfully. So that means, when I go out, I'm not as exhausted when I come home, which is always a good thing. But it's been good. It's been nice. It's been um, a little quiet, to be honest, which is also good. But just doing errands basically the whole week, and hopefully things will get more exciting and sort of pick up in the next little while, as far as like doing something or going somewhere, something like this. But until that happens, not a terrible amount has been going on here. Um, Even in the news wise and stuff like this, I'm kind of out of the loop, so who knows? But I did want to, of course, preface what we're doing today. So, as I've mentioned before, last week we looked at a video on Star Trek Deep Space Nine that I did for the Dirty Bunch a couple of years ago, around 2023, I believe. And I have 8 of those videos. So today I'm going to be sharing the second one with you, which is called My History with History. And this one's a really nice video that I really enjoyed, sort of talking about where and why my interest in history come from. I talk about my family and some of their stories. So anyway, I really, really enjoyed it. I really thought it was something really good to talk about more. And of course, next week I'm going to go on to another one and do that for the next coming, I think, about 8 weeks or so. And then after that, I think I discussed this last week a little bit, but I did a bunch of videos, maybe 3 or 4 of them or more, maybe 5 of them, with our late great friend Doug Scott Kramer. And also about 2, 3 years ago. Um, and we talked a lot about different religious organizations that I had some experience with, either experience for a short time, or a one-off experience. And so I've written a list down, and I'm going to do at least probably a talk. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do like a presentation. Maybe for some of them I will, like a PowerPoint or a Google Slides, you know, presentation. But I'm thinking of doing like more like a lecture, like a talk about some of the statistics of the groups and so forth. So there'll be quite a few, including but not limited to things like the Hare Krishnas, the Soka Gakkai International, the Baha'i Faith, the Quakers, Self-Realization Fellowship, Ekankar, Tibetan Buddhism. There's were a few, just to name a few that I had been involved in, and I really want to go through and talk about my experiences, within those groups. Most of them either benign or somewhat positive, some not as positive, but we'll get to that. We'll talk about things that I've learned and over the years and whatnot. But yeah, without further ado, I did have some technical issues last week, unfortunately. But what I'm going to do now is I'll start the video, and I will be here. I will be here watching my video from my phone. And so that way, or should I say, I should be watching my video from here, as well as my phone. And then, if there are any comments or any questions, anything that you want to say, please type them into the chat. And then at the end, I'll do a conclusion and some of my tell you some of my thoughts, and then we'll make a conclusion if there are any. For example, any start comments. Um, and I'll keep doing this format again for the next little while. So without further ado, I'm going to put myself on mute, and then I'm going to start the video. So yeah, so again, going back here, my biggest influence again from history just had to do with my grandparents. My grandparents lived through, the 20th century, and they were pretty much all refugees that came to Canada during various points of the 20th century. And just giving some sort of, bullet points on this. So my maternal grandfather, so the father of my mother, was born in the Ottoman Empire all the way back in 1905, and he had gone through a pretty rough life, living in what is called West Macedonia, and then he also grew up in Varna, Bulgaria. And also Varna at the time when he was growing up, I shouldn't even say it's part of Bulgaria, it was actually part of Romania. And because 1905, by the time he was, of course, 18, he had lived through a number of different wars that had gone through that entire area of the Balkans. So in 1912 and 13, there were two Balkan wars, which basically set the mood for World War One. Then, of course, World War One happened between 1914, 1918, and then what's called either called the Greco-Turkish War or the Turkish War of Independence, which started in 1920 after a treaty, which kind of split up the Anatolian Peninsula. And this guy named Mustafa Kemal didn't like that. He was more of a Turkish nationalist, and so he started to invade the Italian areas and the Greek areas and the areas that were given to England. And he also went into Armenia and basically seized what is basically today what we would know as Turkey. So between 19 I guess 12 and 1923, my grandfather had seen that, and he was 18 in 1923. And then in 1930, my grandfather came to Canada as a refugee. He had very strong left-wing political views that at the time the Romanians didn't really like. So he jumped ship and he came to Canada in 1930 as a political refugee. He was drafted to the Canadian Army, but he was a conscientious objector to his political views. So he ended up giving humanitarian aid during the war. And then he lived until just a few weeks before his 93rd birthday. And he was just a very, very gentle person. He loved gardening. He loved, he was a farmer basically for most of his life. And he would tell a lot of these stories. Like I remember growing up and asking him how he had run a small convenience store, butcher shop, sort of small grocery shop in Toronto. And he always remembered what the price of bread was and coffee and whatever. He just had that kind of a brain, and he kept ledgers to the day that he died of everything that he ever bought and everything that he since he got off the boat in 1930. So he just had a very very disciplined kind of mind, and lived a very
very interesting, hard life. My maternal grandmother was next. She was born in March of 1921. She was born in Toronto, but her parents were refugees that left the Ottoman Empire first in 1903. In 1903, a group of Macedonian nationalists committed what was called the Ilindian Prehobrajove, which is a long Slavic word, which was an uprising, and it was unsuccessful. So many ethnic Macedonians left for Canada and the US in 1903. 1912 was the Balkan Wars, and she grew up in Toronto. My great uncle, who I actually didn't know, he died about 5 years before I was born, but he served in the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. He landed, I'm not sure exactly if it was the same day as D Day, but he landed sort of around D-Day, maybe plus or minus, well, I shouldn't say minus, but maybe he landed 3 or 4 days or a week after, and then he fought in the war until the Netherlands was liberated, and he did see combat action. And then, of course, my grandmother had a big family, so she had a brother and she had two other sisters, and they had a lot of cousins. So many of her cousins actually served in the Second World War, including when I was growing up. One of my first cousins, I believe, or one of my grandma's first cousins, I should say, he was an older gentleman named Bob. And I remember going over to his house when I was in high school, and he had like a den that was basically his room where he kept all of his war memorabilia. So he had letters and pictures and stuff, and he was also he was in the army. And again, I think he landed somewhat after on D-Day with the Canadian Army, and he fought his way basically through France and into the Netherlands and even into Germany. And he was there for the liberation of Paris. So I saw lots of photos, and he collected, like, he had like Hitler Youth knives, and he had a bunch of stuff from the Nazis and stuff. Like, it was really interesting, the stuff that he had collected. My paternal grandmother came next. She was born in October 1921. And she had kind of a very interesting history too, because my great grandfather, whom I didn't know, made boots for the Austro-Hungarian army during World War One, and then she ended up making boots because she was a shoemaker for the Hungarian army during World War II. So they were always in factories and part of the war effort. My great uncle, again, someone I did not get to meet, he died during the war. He was forcibly conscripted into the Hungarian army. And of course, for those people who know, Hungary in World War II went and fought with the Nazis. They were part of the Axis. And they went to fight in the Eastern Front, and they committed horrible atrocities against the Jewish community and the Ukrainian community and the Roma community, just horrible. So the story that I got was my great uncle saw those things, and then unfortunately, when he came back, he had PTSD and some problems, and he died. So, pretty tragic. My grandma lost her father and her brother during the war. So the other thing is she also lived through the Allied bombings of Budapest. So when I was growing up, my grandmother was deathly afraid of thunderstorms. So whenever it would be a big thunderstorm outside, she would like get into a really huge panic attack, and she would like lock herself in the restroom or whatever. And I never knew why. My sister, who's older, kind of remembers this a bit more, because my grandmother died. I was 7. My sister was 11. I remember asking my grandfather one time, like, why was my grandmother so afraid of thunderstorms? And he said, well, you have to understand, thunderstorms and like artilleries and bombing, they kind of sound the same. So your grandmother was kind of getting PTSD. She was reliving those bombings that she was a part of. And it just kind of hit me with a ton of bricks. Like, we just used to think, oh, grandma, she's, again, she's afraid. Why is she so afraid? But there's a reason behind that, and you know, it's obviously a terrible reason, but that's what her memories were. And then my paternal grandfather, he was born January 1927, and his life was very interesting. My grandfather joined a resistance movement during the Second World War. He was Jewish. Both of his parents died in the Holocaust. and he was imprisoned in 1944 by the Nazis. After the war, of course, there was the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. He was arrested by the communist police. He was interrogated, and that prompted him to leave with my grandmother and with my father. And they walked on foot from Budapest. They crossed the Austrian border, and then eventually they came to Canada. So I grew up with a lot of these stories, people that survived the war, that saw Paris get liberated, that were there, a few days after D-Day. And, you know, my grandfather always remembered Turks coming into the village and doing horrible things, and Greeks coming in and, and being forced and having no democracy. And like, so I was always aware of, having my family going through these horrible atrocities, but being able to come to Canada and sort of set up a new life, and then, bring those stories that they had experienced firsthand and told us, in order for us to be appreciative of the fact that, living in Canada, we live in peace, we have a very stable democracy. We have social issues and social problems, but we deal with them, in a different way. We deal them in a democratic way. We have a good healthcare system, a welfare system, like, just to always know where we came from and to be appreciative. So I would say that those memories and those stories were my first inspiration and influence into learning about history in the past. When I was in high school and community college, so now the age is roughly 14 to, let's say, 22, I started getting really involved in movies and television shows. And these are just some examples of some of the media that really influenced me at the time. So when I was in high school or just before high school, my favorite movie of all time is Platoon. I don't know if you guys have seen it and know about it. It's a movie about the Vietnam War. So it's a Vietnam War film with Charlie Sheen. It's from 1986, so he's like 20. Tom Berenger's in it, Willem Dafoe's in it, Johnny Depp's in it, Forrest Whitaker's in it. It's like a fantastic movie. But I saw this movie, I think I was like 13 or 14, watched it on television, and I just loved it. And I probably watched it over 100 times since then. And it's a history movie. It's about Vietnam. It's about war. It's about soldiers. It's like, I don't know, just very, very different kind of interesting film. The other one is Born on the Fourth of July. I know some people don't like Tom Cruise, but it's Tom Cruise's best performance, in my opinion, his best acting performance ever. He plays a gentleman named Ron Kovic, who I was lucky enough to meet a little while ago, maybe 13, 14 years ago. It's it's another war movie. It's also like Platoon, written and directed by Oliver Stone, based on a book, which is the memoir of Ron Kovic called Born on the Fourth of July. I highly recommend that because there's also a part of that movie where he comes home and he's trying to deal with health issues and stuff and being neglected, and it's very powerful. When I was in high school in 1998, when I was 15, both The Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan came out. I think I may have seen The Thin Red Line in '99 when it was released, but the summer of '98, and then it was Saving Private Ryan. And I remember, we just talked about that a little bit, about the opening scene on Omaha Beach. And then they re-released it in the fall. They re-released Saving Private Ryan in the fall, and I remember watching it again. And as far as combat scenes, memorable movie scenes of all time, that opening 20 minutes is just completely brutal, gory, but like some of the best, I would say, cinematic, battle sequences. And just knowing like what these guys went through, and how veterans of D-Day like publicly thanked Steven Spielberg for making that such a bloody, gory film, like just very very harrowing. Um, there is also a Star Trek connection. For those who know the original series, James Doohan, or Doohan, who played Scotty, he was a member of the Canadian Army, Royal Canadian Army, and he landed on Juno Beach on June 6, 1944, which is, of course, one of the 5 beaches that the Allies invaded. I believe he was with the Canadian Artillery. He was wounded, but he saw the film, and he also publicly thanks Steven Spielberg, because next to Omaha Beach, the second most heavily defended beach was Juno Beach. So it was also pretty bad, and James Doohan saw a lot of that stuff. Um, and then for movies, Europa, Europa. This is a movie about 30 years old. It's about a young Jewish man who hides the fact that he's Jewish and joins the German army and fights, and then becomes a prisoner of war with the Soviets, and then actually fights for the Soviets. And it's actually based on on someone's real life. So just again, these movies were just quite fantastic. And just briefly to go through some of these TV shows and miniseries before we move on. Combat is an old show from the 1960s. It was on ABC. It was about a squad of soldiers in World War II. So it was basically like a war movie, but extended to a TV show. Tour of Duty was a show on CBS from 87 to 1990. It was about Vietnam. Band of Brothers, which comes out of Saving Private Ryan. That came out when I was in college. In 2001, there was a mini series, a two-part series, I should say, called Uprising, which was about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which aired on NBC, and then Blackadder. I don't know if you guys, any British fans here, I'm sure probably remember BBC's Blackadder had 4 seasons. The first 3 seasons dealt with kind of like Elizabethan, Victorian, kind of older English history. But the last season, which was called Blackadder Goes Forth, I believe, or Goes On, one of those two, was about World War One and the trench
Goes
warfare.
forth.
And
Yeah.
yeah, goes forth. And yeah, very like I think only 6 episodes a season, but the very final scene of the very final episode of Blackadder Goes Forth is quite like pretty shocking, pretty devastating, I think.
Interesting story about that final
Yeah.
scene.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Just the final scene was never meant to be filmed that way, and it's that they accidentally destroyed the footage, so they had to slow it down, and that's why we ended up with that final ending for Blackadder Goes Forth.
Oh, really? Because it's pretty infamous if you know Blackadder. And I remember watching that as a teenager, watching those 6, and then because in Canadian TV is very, we get a lot more American TV, but of course we get a lot of BBC, Channel 4, and so forth. So a lot of like Doctor Who and whatever. And Blackadder was one of those ones I used to watch quite a bit with Rowan Atkinson and Hugh Laurie, which when they went on to do quite amazing things, just not just in the UK but also in the US. I got into my undergrad pretty late. I was, I guess, like 34, I guess, when I started undergrad. Yeah, in 2017. So that was a little bit later. But I started my undergrad in Canada in a Canadian university. And I sort of started to develop different interests, and I started to learn different things about history. So on the left side here, these are just things that I kind of learned, not necessarily did they become interests of mine in that sense, but they were very valuable things to learn about history. So, I learned there's different perspectives on history, and there's different schools of thought. When most people think of history, I especially like this, they might think of political history, which is very much chronological. It's about people, it's about, maybe battles and wars and dates and generals and so forth. But there's different interpretations. So one of the first things that you learn when you get into an undergrad history course is different sources of history, and we have primary sources and secondary sources. The difference being primaries, of course, are first-hand accounts. Secondary sources are secondary accounts, and how we need to look at both, because some people will observe history and they might not know the exact reason why this larger developing thing is going on. So if you think of American history and you think of the Civil War, for example, diaries from the Civil War are primary. They help, very, very much get into the thoughts of a soldier. But years and years later, when things are discovered, then historians will give it into a larger, more bigger context, and that's the secondary source. I also learned a little bit about what's called social history. And social history, it comes from Germany throughout the 1960s. And it was the idea that, marginalized communities and people who are generally overlooked in society also have a history. So we're talking about those who are people of color, the indigenous peoples, children, women, LGBTQ, the disabled, etc. They have a history. And oftentimes throughout history, they are either ignored or put to the side. So social historians will look for those kinds of, narratives. And it is interesting the fact that obviously when war is happening, women suffer quite a bit. They sometimes are called in World War II to actually make the ordnances and the armaments. But you think of the emotional sides of, losing a husband. Again, it's heteronormative because of the times. But, losing a husband essentially means you lose your ability to gain money and your children go fatherless. And what's a life like for a woman after that? Well, that's a very interesting part of history that generally, like political historians like myself, don't really look into, but social historians do. Urban history is very interesting. It's not just about architecture, which is a wonderful type of history to look at movements and so forth. But if you think of things like gentrification, think of public spaces, think of the way cities were designed, think of how London was back in 1890. There wouldn't have been many parks. There was tons of pollution, children working in factories. Today, there's completely the opposite. We're talking about, solar powered and bike lanes and all this kind of thing. So urban historians will look at that. Historiography, of course, is the study of the writings of history, but also the writings of historians themselves. And I took a couple classes on this because what we do in historiography is we look at the actual texts or books from historians and usually in modern times and essentially critique it and try to figure out, what are the writings and who are they for and things like this. So it's a very interesting more macro perspective of history. And then we get into narratives, right? We have to ask ourselves questions as historians when we look at a document. We have to think about who is history written for. So is history written for the people who win the wars? And of course, then we're neglecting all the people who lose, including, which is what social historians go after, or people who are born into a non-privileged status. Then who gets to write history? Because is it the winners who write history? What about oral traditions? We think about colonialism throughout North and South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. Well, the colonial powers wrote the history. The indigenous peoples had their own history, but they were largely forgotten. And then who experiences history? Do we all experience history? Is there a class divide? And all that kind of thing. So again, some of the stuff I don't necessarily take into my own perspectives today, but it was very valuable to learn those things. And then the other part here are just some subjects I wanted to go over on what I took. This is not a complete list, but history. Of course, history classes are often subdivided by continent, and so I took European, African, North American and Asian and South American history courses. And in Europe, I took a European history course, which dealt with from the years 1815 to 1914. So that's the end of the Napoleonic Wars to the beginning of World War I. I took a class on European nationalism, the French Revolution, which is incredibly interesting, as well as terrorism. In African history, I studied 3 classes. One was on colonization after decolonization, after World War II and some of its problems and issues. I did a class on African economic history, which then led me to a more specialized class where I looked at what's called political ecology. So this is natural resources. And of course, we know that the West and the Western colonials really, really plundered the African continent of diamonds and gasoline and lots and lots of stuff. So I read a lot about that. Rubber was another one. In North America, I did take classes on the American Revolution, including some of the ideas behind the revolution, colonialism in Canada, and indigenous history in Canada and in North America, which I had never really done before, because when I was growing up, indigenous history was there, but it wasn't as emphasized as it is now. In Asian history, I took a course on the 19th century East Asia, so the end of the Qing dynasty and so forth. And then one on communism in China, which included Mao and the Cultural Revolution. And then finally, for South America, I took a class on the Spanish and Portuguese colonial history. So I learned about Hernan Cortes, and I learned about New Spain, and I learned about the indigenous peoples, the Taínos, and the Caribs, as well as the Tupis in Brazil, and some of the issues going on in the Amazon right now with indigenous peoples. I learned about some of the Dominican Catholic priests that were against colonialism and the indentured servants. I learned the difference between the different, and this is always a tragedy for history, but the different categories of people. So the whites, the mulattoes, the Chicanos, and all these kinds of Mayorkas and Judaismos and so forth. So how the Spanish and the Portuguese, subdivided people.
May I just
Um,
say something? Just add something, because last week we were talking about the difference between Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, and then we talked about
Yeah.
the different the stressed. Anyway, I think one of the reasons why our Brazilian Portuguese is stressed on syllables instead of the phrase, like it's because of the Tupi influence. Because I think the Tupi language sounds a lot like ta 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 ta, and we have a lot of Tupi words. So I think that's one of the reasons. I don't know that for sure. I don't know. I don't have any evidence, any but something that I suppose to be true.
It would make sense. Again, you have to think about when a language enters a completely different world from Europe to Brazil, to South America, it's going to adapt to your neighbors. And if your neighbors are not Spaniards and Frenchmen and Arabs, then of course you're going to take on some speech patterns. And I'm sure, again, in Brazilian Portuguese, I've heard, because I'm not as familiar with Brazilian Portuguese, but there are words that do come from indigenous languages and maybe also African languages. So that makes complete sense
Abakashi.
because, yeah, 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 and traditions are different as well. Exactly. So most languages, unless they are in a mountain or on an island, are usually do not evolve in a vacuum. They evolve around their friends
Yeah.
and others as well. And I find that with
I just
Hungarian as well.
I just wanted to bring it up because I remember last week we were talking
Yeah.
about that, and I had thought about this before, but I couldn't think about like what changed. Why are they so different in something so essential in the language, And then it just occurred to me when I said, I feel like, yeah, I know we have a lot of Tupi influence, so that's probably and our Brazilian Portuguese sounds a lot like what I think the Tupi sounds like. If you think
Of
of the
course, yeah.
Tupi words, they're a lot like our Brazilian Portuguese.
Of course, and yeah, the other thing too is to note there were hundreds, if not thousands, of different groups and cultures and traditions of the indigenous peoples before the French, the English, the Portuguese, and the Spanish came over, and the tragedy of those things with the Incas and the Mayas. We learned a lot about how Cortez, when he took the city of Tenochtitlan, he really sided with a certain group against another group, and it's just very tragic. So, what I'm glad, at least now, is that those narratives are becoming more popular in history, especially academic history. I know that in Europe we kind of go through very similar things a lot, and it's easy to be very, very like Eurocentric. But I'm very, very glad that I learned who the Tupi people were, because otherwise I wouldn't know, and also for the people in the Amazon and so forth. Because other than that, it's just focusing on Europe. And even though I love it, there's a big world out there as well. Um, in the fourth year, okay, so it's interesting the way that college and university works between the Commonwealth countries and non-Commonwealth countries. In Canada, and I know in the Commonwealth countries like Great Britain and Australia, usually a Bachelor of Arts is a 3-year program. I think that might be the same in some U.S. schools. But in Canada, there's also a fourth year option, which would make it very similar to an American undergrad. So 3 or 4 years. So I studied basically transferred into a particular university. I got my bachelor's, so my 3 years bachelor's, and then I took an option to do a fourth year, which is called an honors year. And at the end of this year, I wrote a thesis, which was 15 pages. And at the time, I decided to go a little obscure and talk about what was called the German Revolution and the German Civil War, which happened just after World War One, and actually even started kind of a couple days even before World War One ended. So basically around November of 1918 to roughly, I think, April of 1919. And so the person on the left here is Rosa Luxemburg. If you haven't heard of her, she was a young woman born in Poland, spent most of her adult life in Germany. She was Jewish. She happened to be a communist. She founded this thing called the Spartacus League, named after Spartacus, of course, the Roman slave revolter. Or the movie is Spartacus is sort of about him. And she ended up, her and her Spartacus League ended up taking over the city of Berlin for a short period in January of 1919 before they were crushed by a militia of far right-wing nationalist Germans. And then a few months later, in the spring of 1919, on the right-hand side, we have a map of the Bavarian Socialist Soviet Republic, excuse me, and the Bavarian Soviet Republic lasted for 3 weeks. They wanted to make an actual satellite state of the USSR, and it was also crushed by a group called the Freikorps or Free Corps, I guess. And some of those people in the Freikorps or Free Corps would end up becoming like very influential Nazis. So it's kind of this like, I looked at the scare tactics that were being used. I looked at Rosa Luxemburg. She wrote a lot until she later died. She was actually executed in January of 1919. So I looked at this whole situation and what went on, and sort of how it kind of started, where Germany was becoming more right wing. So that was a 15-page paper. In my master's program, which I'm in now, I've done a couple of PowerPoint presentations. I've also done a couple of essays. So I'll say to which ones are which. But one of the first things I did was I did a large PowerPoint presentation, about 20 slides, to a class on dictatorships in Eastern Europe. And I talked about Romanian history, especially following World War One. So the photo is of a guy who is like basically burned into the collective psyche of every Romanian. His name is Nicolae Ceausescu, and he was the communist dictator of communist Romania from 1965 to 1989. So my PowerPoint presentation dealt with Romania winning World War One essentially, and then transitioning towards communism. And then he and his wife were actually executed by the Romanian people, by the new Romanian ruling party, I guess, on 25th December of 1989, live on television. And was called the Romanian Revolution. So I went through that whole history. And then I kind of obsessed with Romance languages. Now that I'm learning Romanian, I really enjoy them. And there's some really interesting Romance languages that were in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Not just Romanian, which of course is in the east, but in the west, this peninsula here is called the Istrian Peninsula. It's part of Croatia. It's like a little triangle that sticks out of Croatia into the Adriatic Sea. And there are people there today that still speak a dialect of Romanian, as well as sort of a dialect, maybe its own language, but it's very similar. It's called Istriot, and is very similar to Venetian. So I wrote an essay about their developments and how they got to this particular place, and how they were treated, and what their lives were like in Austria-Hungary. When, of course, now most of these individuals would have become either part of Yugoslavia after World War II, or part of Italy, and most left to become part of Italy. So there are only collectively less than 2,000 people that actually speak the Romanian dialect and this other Istriot language still left here in Istria. But it's just very interesting because, of course, those languages come from Latin, and a lot of them, roots of those words have been there for a very long time. And there's just very, very few people there now. I did another PowerPoint presentation to a class about economic life of the Jewish community in Transylvania following the First World War. And the picture here is of a vineyard. because basically the Jewish community, about 55% of us participated in winemaking, which is a really, really big deal for the Jewish community because we use it every week. And so I took a look at what was the agricultural life of the Jewish community. Was the Jewish community accepted in Romania, which they generally were? Also, Moldova is part of Romania, and Transylvania kind of part of Romania after World War One. So I just looked at economic life and economic activity, especially winemaking and so forth. And the last one was another gentleman here. His name is Josip Broz Tito, and he was the communist dictator of Yugoslavia from 1946, 45, 46, until he died in 1980. And the economics in Yugoslavia was called market socialism. They had these little cooperatives that were publicly owned, and they were owned by the workers, and it kind of worked for a little while, and then it didn't work. And I talked about hyperinflation and all this kind of stuff. So between all these four things, my interests are kind of in like history of dictators, history of languages, history of the Jewish community, history of economics. That's kind of where all these things develop. And then very briefly today, a little cut off here, so I do apologize. My academic interests are more in the region of Central Europe. So I'm mainly doing research and studying history of Hungary, Romania, and Croatia. Usually Transylvania and Istria. I like the late modern era, which begins with the French Revolution and ends at the end of World War II. And then the two big areas of history that I've been studying is the history of nationalism, revolution, and language, how they all develop between 1848, which was a big year of revolutions in Europe, until the start of the Second World War. And then also interwar Jewish community. So interwar from 1918 to 1938, which in the Jewish community in Transylvania, which has become a big interest of mine. What were they doing? Where did they come from? What happened to them? What were they farming, etc. What were their neighbors saying about them? Did they get along with the non-Jewish community? And then, of course, other interests. You guys know I have a big interest in religion and religious studies. I really, really enjoy it. Love learning about that, especially comparative religious studies, philosophy of religion, philosophy of language, philosophy of economics, science. I really enjoy economics itself, and then political ecology. So basically, what I try to do is just look Central Europe, look at some of the regions that I'm interested in, and then go from there. And so there's a lot of different topics and different things that I'm learning every day that take me to different paths and so forth. So yeah, yes, Julian.
What is political ecology?
Political ecology is basically the study of how governments and political groups and politicians treat natural resources. So, for
Okay.
example, in Africa, the study of the diamond mining or
Mm-hmm.
rubber. So, you have a natural resource. Sometimes rubber is not a natural resource, but comes from a tree. So it's the political implications of ecology. So do they exploit? Do they, what do they do with the natural resources? Who are the people that are trying to fight for the natural resources? Are they
Mhm.
shared and owned equally? Like all that kind of stuff. So think of it like political science and ecology together, because
Cool. Yeah, makes sense.
unfortunately, our environment is a political issue.
All right, I'm coming back here. There I am. So yeah, thank you, everyone. I just wanted to acknowledge two of our friends here. Two Mark Apostles have made their illustrious appearance tonight, and that, of course, is Shell, the one with cats, Apostle number 5. There you are. And of course, Irish Mart, Apostle number 3 are both here. Thank you, ladies, for being here. Appreciate it so much. Um, I hope you've found the video interesting. Again, this was one of those that I did on the Nerdy Bunch from a couple years ago. The next one I am going to do is another replay like this, and on the history of the Hungarian language, which I did with Joe and Clearwater Chad, who are of course my number 1 and number 2 Mark Fossils, and that was at least again probably about 2 years ago as well. But yeah, thanks everybody. I know that if you're watching on the replay again, please like the video if you haven't already. And if you've come here through a search or this is the first time you're on my channel, please look through my other videos, see if there's anything that you and like another video, and please consider subscribing. As I said, I'd really like to get more subscribers, and I would obviously really like to get the watch hours so I can get to the level of getting monetized, and then being able to do this would be great with some monetization. But as always, thank you again, and thank you for those who are showing up. So thank you, Shell. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Irish Mart, the same. It's really amazing that you both showed up today. So thank you. Again, if you're watching on the replay, thank you as well. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, if you have anything, any thoughts at all, please leave them in the comments, and I will do my best, of course, to answer them in the as soon as I can. I like to interact with, of course, all of my subscribers and followers and friends here. So again, a big thank you, and hope you enjoyed today. Hope you enjoyed this evening, and I hope that you have a great rest of your weekend and a great next week. I will, as always, put up my schedule, whether or not I should be able to do a stream next week, but just in case, if anything happens, I'll let everybody know midweek. But again, I should be able to, and it should be on the history of the Hungarian language. So again, I hope you enjoy that as well, because it's a language that I speak not well, but I've been learning it for 5.5 years, and it's quite it's quite the challenge. And I think I do a little grammar demonstration right at the end where I translate a sentence from English to Hungarian to show how the grammar works in Hungarian. And I think for people who speak English or another Indo-European language, it's going to be quite something. And so I kind of like that aspect of language and so forth, where you sort of have to bend the way that you think a little bit. Thank you, Shell, so much. Yeah, thank you. I do appreciate you being here, as I said, and thank you to Irish Mart. And in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.